So we're very lucky to be joined tonight by Paul Morley. Paul Morley was born in 1957 in Stockport. Between 1977 and 1984, his work at the NME alongside that of people like Ian Penman completely reshaped what music journalism could be in Britain, and we're still kind of dealing with the ramifications of that stuff in music writing today. Morley as well had his own sort of pop cultural intervention with Frankie Goes to Hollywood. In the last 10 years, Morley's been writing books about people like Bob Dylan, David Bowie, a book of Grace Jones, a history of classical music, the North. And so I'm glad that he's moved away from those very small topics to finally deal with the meaty stuff of the life of Tony Wilson. So if we please give a big round of applause to Paul Morley. So in between other projects, some of which I've just mentioned then, you've been working on this book for a decade, but I understand the genesis of that really comes about 30 years prior to that.
Well, I suppose
Need to turn the mic on.
Yeah.
you didn't tell me that. Good.
No.
Might be a bit. Yeah, should be. Is it good for people here?
Pointing towards you now.
The second trick of microphone use.
Should we begin again?
Yes, so in between other projects, you've been working on the book for about a decade, but obviously the first time you became aware you might be writing a book about Tony Wilson is about 30 years prior to that. If you
Yes, I think so. I think it was part of the willpower of Tony that he kind of planted the idea in my head. I'd only just become a writer in a way. I've been a writer for many months. Tony was certainly the first media professional that ever told me I was a writer. That was significant. And then within a couple of years of that, he was starting to talk about books and therefore kind of history, and telling me that when the history was written, I would be writing the history, and I'd never considered that. I was only 2021, so it was kind of slightly surprising to sort of get my head around what he was talking about. I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I guess that was part of what he did. He set up circumstances. He made things look like they were about to happen, and then through sheer willpower, kind of helped them happen. And that little thing he planted in my head about writing the book, became true. And in fact, the particular detail of which he was talking about, when he told me, "I'm showing you this because you are going to write the book." I've now mentioned it in 5 books.
Yeah.
And in a way, that momentum began then. The weird thing, the idea of writing a book was way beyond anything I could understand or do or believe in, because people like me didn't write books. Tony somehow was already anticipating there would be books of which he would be in many ways at the centre of, and also that it would be me writing it. And almost by doing that, it was almost a metaphor for everything he did. Almost by doing that, he helped create the situation where it happened.
And is that something that will continue then into your interactions with him? Because obviously, like a lot of friendships, it had hot and cold periods. And would there be points when you would be in situations and think, this is also for the book, this is going in? Was there bits of information you were privy to, or not really at all?
Not really, it didn't really work like that. It was just this particular, very dynamic moment in the early part. And then after that, things sort of took their shape. And yes, absolutely, we'd fall out, he'd fall out with me, go on epic sulks. He'd be intimidating, he'd be sympathetic and generous as well. He could be all sorts of things all at the same time. But even then, I still didn't really think for many years that there was anything in this idea of a book. But I think he was doing it with some of his bands earlier on as well, saying, that this band is the Pink Floyd of this generation, this band is that, this band will be, dancing around swimming pools in Los Angeles when they were at the time, selling tickets to 75 people. It was this kind of weird anticipation of this. He was very much a kind of historian in the way he operated. He knew a lot of things and how one thing would lead to another and how things were set up. in the mid-70s, which was very unusual also when it was combined with an interest in pop culture. So he had this kind of weird sense of how history was made and how people made it, and therefore why doesn't he make it? And therefore he needed his kind of colleagues and collaborators and his writing team and these people around him to help him make it. But he was very much in this idea that he could make history, he could make things happen.
I guess it's quite an unusual sense of history as well, because if you look at what people like yourself were doing in the immediate post-punk years, it was very towards the future forward. And so to have someone like Tony who was able to bring in sort of 18th, 19th century reference points must have felt odd.
It was strange, and also we didn't understand what he was doing. And all these old buildings in Manchester that we tended to make invisible because they weren't of the future. We were very keen on the idea of making a future. The fact that he was comfortable in those buildings, went into these buildings, understood how they worked, what they meant, how they started to piece together culture far before teenage culture.
Yeah.
It was also a significant influence on how he exploited and manipulated and made happen teenage culture. He had this, better sense of how things worked. And, he would talk about Manchester as the innovative city, the city where things happened first, the city you could take all the way back to the Garden of Eden almost. In the 70s, when the rest of us weren't convinced at all, and to an extent that stubborn commitment he had to talking like this was one of the things that made us a little bit suspicious of him. Because he was talking about things way beyond what we were thinking. And what we saw in the city was that very almost cliched idea that the city is dead, we must make the city, and it will come because of this, and then the punk thing made the city feel like this. Tony had those ideas almost sort of in place before that happened. The idea that the city must be remade, the city must move into the future. And he took opportunities once he saw them happen, but at the time it did make us slightly suspicious of that, of the energy, and also the mystery of what he was talking about. And I think that was because to some extent he was slightly older, I say, than the rest of us. But if you think of an early scene in Manchester in 76, 77, there's maybe 40, 50 people. He's 5 years older than the rest of us, and back then 5 years old was a generation. To be 26 then seemed to be the end of your interest in pop music. And also, he'd been to Cambridge, and he'd had time at ITN, and he brought back to Manchester this unusual, wider sense of bigger things that was also unusual. None of us really understood how that worked or why he was like that, but he was made different because he'd already had in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of experiences.
And we'll come on to discussing some of those experiences that Wilson had shortly because they are interesting. But one thing with the book, as a writer, you sometimes end up with these older, I wouldn't use the word mentor, but these older figures who sometimes might be editors. And you kind of torn between wanting to impress them and sometimes wanting to rebel against them. And that dynamic seemed at play in terms of your life with Wilson to an extent. So you seem quite unhappy that you went off to London, started ignoring Manchester things. How true is that reading?
Well, he was really angry with me when in the late 70s I got a job at the NME, which was based in London, and at the time that was the kind of thing you just didn't turn down. But he was already very aware of a sort of talent drain, if you like, before you would have even thought there was such a thing, that people were leaving Manchester, leaving the north. They would always leave, like in a way he had early on. He'd left, he'd gone to Kinney's, and then he'd gone to ITN, and coming back was almost an accident in a way. But he was furious because he wanted to build something, and he was building his team. He was building the people around him. He kind of built almost like a TV producer would. He'd have a team of 5 or 6 people with certain things. He was very good at that. Factory was like that. It was like built like a TV crew because that was his experience. You needed certain people to do certain things. And I became one of those people that was part of his writing team almost, because he almost assembled that. And the idea that I would leave Manchester to go to London, I never considered it that I was leaving to go to London. I considered I was leaving to go to the NME, which was an abstract place, which I could put Manchester and other wonderful things into. And that it wasn't specifically London, although I had to physically go there. But he was furious, and within probably 13 minutes had replaced me with John Savage. Because he needed something,
Yes.
and he did it. He bought, and he was thrilled because he brought John up from London.
Yes.
through Manchester. So he did the opposite to what I'd done. But that was a kind of weird crack in our relationship that took a considerable amount of time to recover from in a way. And I also was penalised myself by the NME for writing about a lot of factory music because they considered I was part of the community or the team or on some kind of retainer, so they banned me from writing about factory music very early on. And then Tony got annoyed because he thought I was rejecting him, and that created, you know, but still within it, we were kind of together. We were kind of strange cultural lovers, but we also had periods of really fraught times when he thought I was betraying him, and I was angry that he was so intimidating, kind of a bully.
Yeah, yeah.
But then you needed to be a bully then, in a way that's very difficult to explain now. That kind of pressure that you would put on people was necessary to make things happen.
I certainly like the detail that when you were enjoying some success with Frankie Goes to Hollywood, you would then be in Manchester and meet him, and he would just not address this whatsoever.
No, not even to tell me off for ripping off factory. You know, like Breton, you know, he would have a go at me saying, you just do Woolworth's factory, you know. But Tony wouldn't even mention it, you know, and to be honest, most of the things that I did that weren't to do with Manchester, he didn't really mention. He was always interested in anything I did that was directly connected with Manchester, a book, an article, you know, anything like that. But anything I did, which was most of the time that he didn't consider to be Manchester, he would blank me on it, you know. Including getting a #1 for 9 weeks with 2 tribes, you know, which I thought was and also it was Liverpool as well, because it was Frankie, it was Liverpool. But I thought
we're not going to go there.
No. But I thought this was, you know, a considerable thing to have done as part of this community. I thought I was part of it. It didn't really matter where we were in the world. We were all part of this community, this scene, and I happened to do it. But no, he wouldn't even mention it. Not even to slag me off.
So as the observant, you might have noticed, we're going to be having some slides during this, which have come from the process of putting together the book. So it's from Fergal and a little bit from the family as well, so gratitude to them for sending that over. And this is Tony Wilson at Cambridge. Now, I had absolutely no idea until reading the book that Tony Wilson was taught by the Welsh socialist intellectual Raymond Williams, and quite convincingly, Paul, in the book you make a case for how that ends up shaping Wilson and Wilson's career, and so I'd be interested in reflections on that.
Well, it's interesting that period, you know, since the book's come out, actually, you know, some people have come forward to say, well, I was at Cambridge with Tony. But as I was writing the book, and it's one of the reasons the book took so long to write, getting a hold of certain people and finding them so that I could complete the book in the way I wanted to, you know, was sort of difficult because Tony's time at Cambridge, he seemed to have disappeared to an extent. And there is an element of a combination of observation and imagination. The idea that at Cambridge there was no doubt his tutor was Raymond Williams, and Raymond Williams was a significant early figure in the treating of culture as a popular thing, popular culture, television, seriously. He was one of the first people to really take the idea of television seriously as an art form, that you would approach it the way you would a Shakespeare play, a Dylan Thomas poem. You would look at the flow during the day's television. You would think about these people who were on, like Eamon Andrews, immediate TV personalities. What were they doing? Why was a cop show immediately followed by The Weather, immediately followed by a quiz show? What does that mean? And I thought it was significant in the late 60s as part of Tony's education, however explicit or direct or regular that was, it was really quite abstract, probably atmospheric. But Raymond Williams is there when Tony's there, and he is his tutor. And I thought, well, that has to be a significant contribution to the weird beast that Tony became. That he became one of these TV personalities that Raymond Williams was one of the first people to ever write so fantastically about.
And he does seem to, at least through the 70s and 80s, have this faith in the power of television as a medium to transmit ideas. If any of you have been to the exhibition at the Museum of Science and Industry, you can see this brilliant letter that Tony Wilson writes Malcolm McLaren, where essentially he's quite, he's visibly pissed off in the letter at Malcolm McLaren for initially not letting the Pistols on So It Goes, and essentially the case he makes is that it's all well and good what you're doing, but until you get the Sex Pistols on television, that is how you really change things. And so that does, that early understanding of what television can do.
Well, it was also significant that it became part of Granada Television, which was, you know, a place where Mavericks and Misfits could function, because of the way it was set up. in the late 50s and early 60s. And for a while it was the kind of intellectual sort of centre of the city. The Guardian, Manchester Guardian ceases to be the Manchester Guardian in the late 50s, early 60s. Granada TV really takes over as the intellectual core of the city. And the building on Key Street, the red light, Granada TV, as some kind of beacon over the city, becomes a very important part of the makeup of the city, what we think of Manchester being. And the great personalities that started working there, very young, great journalists, great broadcasters. And Tony becomes part of that tradition. And it becomes part of a tradition, right, you know, the first time the Beatles were on television is on Granada television. And so for him, you know, with Sex Pistols, he has to get the Sex Pistols on TV for the first time because that seems to be part of that tradition as well. And he was very influenced by working at ITN, writing scripts for people like Sandy Ball and Reginald Bosen. He's very precise, very concise interpretations of messy, spontaneous events that are happening all around that needed to be put into a very unusually, at the time, sort of neat sentences. This is a huge influence on him as well as a broadcaster. So he's compiling an incredible, odd combination of influences. And for me, that sense of why he never left being a broadcaster, even when, you know, the pull was from his colleagues that he should. He didn't want to leave Granada television because it was the most important thing to him in many ways, as much as factory was also the most important thing to him. But he didn't want to leave it because he knew how important it was, and he knew how he could do really unusual things within it. And he got given the opportunity early doors, even though they were never completely sure of him. And he was a bit of a loose cannon, and he was a bit wild. But they also appreciated it to some extent. He was in the tradition of Granada television, the Mavericks and the Misfits.
Yeah, that loose cannon thing is quite interesting with Wilson because, and you kind of hint at this in the book, or I don't know how much of this is my own projection, it's kind of, there is a wasted opportunity when it comes to the TV career, in that for someone of his obvious ability, I mean, if any of you ever watched After Dark, which some of it is on YouTube, the kind of freewheeling late night debate programme, he's an incredibly gifted broadcaster, and that kind of sees out his days doing bits on Granada reports. But would you agree there's a sense of perhaps wasted potential or a career that, because other people at Granada did go on to really thrive in a way that he didn't with broadcasting?
There were other Granada personalities, some of whom he mentored, some of whom started working for him.
Yeah.
Have gone on to have significant roles in television, both as presenters but also as producers, doing all sorts of significant things to this day. They all started working with Tony. Tony was a truly tremendous broadcaster, and there is a world where that would have been his life, and he would have gone on to be a Paxman or foreign correspondent for CNN. Serious television. He was capable and brilliant at live television. He turned it into a kind of art form because he'd come from a world where other personalities and presenters at Granada turned it into an art form. But there's so much in his head. In the mid-70s, he kind of gets bored. He needs more, which eventually leads to factory and to working in the music business. But he doesn't have to sacrifice the broadcasting as well, because Granada TV people don't understand, because they don't understand this other life he has. And the factory people and the music people don't understand, because they don't really understand this other life he has. But in a way, Wilson becomes what he becomes because of these two worlds. And the fact that he could move in and out between them so elegantly and so kind of fluently. There he's doing a live broadcast or interviewing a cabinet minister, and then 3 hours later he's in Turin doing the soundboard for Crispy Ambulance. And that ability he had to move between worlds, but one feeds the other as well. He becomes an unusual character because he's got these two worlds going simultaneously. And he doesn't want to sacrifice one for the other, so he doesn't want to lose the TV to become full-time factory. He doesn't want to lose factory to become full-time Granada. And because of it, oddly, someone we still talk about to this day, he never really moves on in his career. It was a TV presenter, a TV broadcaster, after 20, 30 years of being as good as he was, as varied as he was, doing the kind of things he could do, being one of the greatest live presenters on television, he never really got anywhere. And also with factory, he still sort of maintains a certain kind of momentum that never really goes as far as it could have gone. So one holds back the other, and yet somehow we still talk about him. even though it never exploded, he never became the national treasure. It becomes a kind of warped local treasure, but never a national treasure.
Just a quick one, Sarah. If we just stay on this slide for a little bit longer, we'll go on to the next one. So I'm trying to run a slideshow and do this remotely. Sarah's doing a great job. In the book, you give a sort of potted history of situationism, and I think one of the really commendable things about the book is that there can be this thing in Manchester, and some of it's admirable, I get that, where in trying to commemorate some of the interesting figures that have come out of the city, it ends up creating this kind of flattening effect where these really interesting spiky lives are actually turned into something quite flat and quite narrow, and they become these kind of, like, you've got the mosaics around the city which I quite like, but it doesn't ever give a sense of what's interesting about these people or what motivated them. And I think what Paul's book does is tries to put Tony Wilson back into a bit of a context of the interesting ideas of the 20th century. And so, in terms of your research into Wilson's interest into situationism and how that informs the whole project, if you could talk about that and how he became exposed to that as well.
Well, I make a point in the book of talking about how at Cambridge in the late 60s, which obviously is the era of the big revolutions in the world, in Paris, the revolutionary spirit, students are beginning to suggest there's a possibility of recreating reality. There's the odd occasional glimpse, certainly in Paris, of everything being turned on its head. And so Wilson, 68, he's 18, he's going to Cambridge. He's becoming a student, and students seem to have a lot of interesting power.
Yeah.
And there's Raymond Williams on one hand, sort of, even though he's an outsider of Cambridge, he's still unorthodox, and he's still interested in unorthodox things, an unorthodox way of transmitting information. But as well as Raymond Williams being a kind of abstract mentor, Guy Debord of the Situationists also infects Tony's imagination. There's other people at Cambridge that are interested in it. It becomes quite chic, that kind of radical chic thing. The idea that situationism was at the heart of the revolution in Paris. A lot of slogans that were used were situationist slogans. Tony basically starts to be educated in an abstract way, and I may have made this up, but it seems suitable and appropriate, by Raymond Williams, who is at Jesus College, Cambridge, and is Tony's tutor, and also Guy Debord and other situationists who somehow inspire Tony to think about all sorts of things in a very different way, including music, including what music could be. So he's interested in how music communicates ideas, rather than it just being about nice notes and nice melodies and pretty songs and collecting vinyl. He's interested in other things because these other elements are influencing him. He's a music fan, but he's also interested in unusual ideas and provocative ideas and strange ideas and revolutionary ideas. Elements of the characters that ended up in the Anglican game, they're in Tony's circle, directly or not. That's his world at that time. And I was just interested in the way that this would start to create a certain kind of character that when punk came along, punk almost became the soundtrack for something that didn't have a soundtrack in the late 60s and early 70s. You know, Tony was very interested in Jackson Browne, Leonard Cohen, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, but it's not connected with the kind of ideas he starts to like that are based on situationism and the idea of trying to create an alternative to the rituals that the capitalist, conventional world is giving. Situationism suggests that it's possible to create other rituals, that the rituals we are given and we are told to be obedient to. Why are we only obedient to those? Because they are completely fabricated and they are completely arbitrary. Wilson is influenced by people that want to suggest reality can be made up of different rituals, different events, different occasions, different situations, and when he eventually goes into music, it is that combination of how he was educated and influenced and inspired that makes the difference when he finally goes into music. He's not just interested in music per se. In fact, to some extent, he finds musicians rather boring. He's interested in how it can transmit to a wider audience unusual ideas that have a potential to create these alternative situations.
Yeah, the relationship with music is interesting because it does come along as part of this renaissance in artist-managers, where you've got Bernie Rhodes and Malcolm McLaren, the idea of managers who've also got a kind of intellectual ambition. But I think something that comes across in your book is that you're not that interested in the idea of Tony Wilson as music mogul. It's about something higher than that.
Well, Tony Wilson being a music mogul, being a businessman, being a sort of entrepreneur, impresario, is one of the names that gets attached to him. If it was just that, I wouldn't be interested at all. But I find most of the great music moguls, impresarios, whether it's an Andrew Lloyd Webber or Malcolm McLaren, or an Albert Grossman, these are the kind of people that fascinate Tony, and they are interesting because they're trying to find a way to make sure that music can come through to people instead of a radical content, even though they're dealing with business and they're dealing with contracts and they're dealing with the ruthlessness of that. And Wilson was always fascinated by the wild, romantic music impresario. I think there is some of the greatest influences in him. There's a piece in the book where I start talking about how the first concert he'd ever been to was Peter, Paul and Mary in Manchester in the early 60s. But really that was Albert Grossman, because Albert Grossman managed Peter, Paul and Mary. So the first gig he ever went to was really Albert Grossman, because he was always fascinated by those kind of figures. Obviously McLaren sort of ignited that in him, the idea that by associating yourself with music you can do these extraordinary things, create these events, create these situations, these alternative rituals. And so when he became a little bit more a conventional, possible would-be mogul in the 90s, I wasn't so keen on that, the idea that he was fascinated with contracts. For me, it wasn't really my taste, you know. I liked it when he was more interested in the unusual side of what you could do with music, rather than being too worried about, you know, contracts and lawyers.
Yeah, and then as well, I suppose he was fortunate, incredibly fortunate, in having Rob Gretton and Alan Erasmus, who were able to do some of the more practical elements of sort of the music management. Obviously Rob Gretton is no longer here, but I think Alan Erasmus is a really interesting figure. In that, for those of you who don't know, Alan Erasmus, crucially early part of Factory, but just does not appear in any of the interviews, doesn't do the telly programmes, doesn't do the nostalgia circuit, and that's one of the really interesting scoops that you get in the book, and I'm interested in how that happened.
Well, some people talk to me about why did the book take so long, you know, many years apparently.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like it to me, apparently. And one of the reasons was, there were many reasons, but one of the reasons was I really wanted Alan in the book. It seemed important to have Alan Erasmus in the book, because as you say, he sort of disappears from the history. And there's reasons for that sometimes you can blame him for. And that was the truth when I tried to pin him down to do an interview for the book. You know, he's very vocal about how he's never in the history, but then he won't do the history. And you have to make your own myths. You know, obviously, Wilson was the myth maker. That was his job. But the others needed to stand up for their myth a little bit as well. So it took me about 5 years to finally get that. We had strange liaisons on pavements and in cafes, and he would get up halfway through me speaking to him and disappear. I wouldn't see him again for 2 years. I'd get the occasional text from Africa. He was on some expedition. And then eventually one day I kind of sat him down in one of the hotels that now emerged in Manchester that certainly didn't exist back in the late 70s, early 80s. We sat down at a table, and I remember, to my horror, because I was thinking any minute now he's going to go, any minute now he's going to go. And I looked to my left, and there was a lot of Factory Records paraphernalia on the wall, framed, you know, the way the boutique hotels now do to exploit their association with, you know, that Manchester thing. And I thought, oh God, he's going to think I've done this on purpose. You know? But I managed to keep him, and I managed to get him on tape. And I don't think I would have written the book without him. You know, obviously many excuses as a writer to think, I'm not going to deliver the book. But I really wanted to get Alan in the book, precisely for that reason. There's probably many people that should be in the history that aren't in the book, but for me, at one point, that was a significant sort of achievement to get Alan and put him in. He's like a ghost, you know.
Yeah, in terms of putting together the book, how forthcoming were people to speak? Because I suppose, again, it's a 10-year period and people are at different levels of coming to terms with the life. What was it like in terms of the family or people who worked with him? What were those experiences of tracking down and getting those people to speak like?
Well, what I really loved about it was the opportunity to have these two worlds and try and bring them together. So you've got the Granada world and you've got the Factory world. And for me, what represents the Granada world is Richard and Judy. Because, you know, at one point it was Richard and Judy and Tony. They were a three-piece.
On this one, cue next slide.
And again, I wouldn't have written the book without Richard and Judy. You know. It's fascinating to have Richard and Judy's point of view. You know, early 80s, they're working with Tony, they see him as one particular figure, but they have no idea of this other character that is doing the hacienda, that is doing these bands, this music. They know he does it, and it gives them a certain cool to them. You know, it makes them incredibly cool, and in a way, Richard spent the rest of his life trying to capture that. You know, whenever I see Richard now perform on television, I am seeing a weird, distorted echo of Tony Wilson. And it's Tony, and he learned a lot from Tony, you know. He doesn't know why Tony's interesting or cool or whatever it is. He doesn't know, but he thinks he's got it, you know. And you can see that to this day. So you get a sense of what Tony might have been without Factory, without being that character in Richard Madeley. And Richard Madeley is interesting in the book, and Judy, because they're talking about a Tony that's happening at the same time as he's opening the Factory Records with Gretton and Erasmus and New Order, and he's doing all those kind of things. But they don't really know that. He's a family man, an interesting, unusual family man. He's an interesting, unusual broadcaster, but a great broadcaster. And they're part of one world. And then on the other side, you've got your Erasmuses and your Grettons. And there's a character that sort of crosses over, which is Andy Harris, a television producer that started working with Tony in the late 70s, early 80s, and has now gone on to do things like The Crown and The Queen. He does all these big Netflix blockbusters. He's hugely influenced by Tony, and Tony was so important. And you've got Andy Harris, who sort of operates in, and he could see both Tonys flickering at the same time. So he's kind of there in the edit suite when they're doing The World in Action, when Tony first hears that Ian has died. He's there, and he's also taking Tony out to Bellevue Zoo in the early 80s to do a piece on a boxing kangaroo, Tony's day job. But on the way back to Granada, once they've got this ridiculous piece on the boxing kangaroo ready, Tony's taken him to see the showroom in Manchester. It used to be a yacht showroom. He said, "This is where I'm going to open my club." So you've got this kind of weird flickering between the two worlds that Tony was kind of, nobody liked that he would be doing those two things. So for me, it was important to try and go from Richard and Judy to Alan Erasmus. Because in no other book, in no other world, would those two sets of characters belong in the same story, but through Tony, they're not.
I think certainly the anecdote I enjoyed the most about Madeley is, and you have a better insight into how it happened, but using your knees to steer a car whilst rolling and then smoking a spliff. And you've got Madeley in the passenger seat seeming absolutely terrified by it. But there is this element with the way that Richard and Judy speak about Tony Wilson is there's a real love for him.
Yeah.
Actually, at the end of his life, it's Richard Madeley who really puts a shift in terms of phoning round over and other people who may have been alienated on the wrong side of Tony Wilson and saying, look, you know, we need to raise money. And yeah, I think what you said about that duality is really, really thrilling.
Well, it's interesting in the TV world there would be this love, because in a way you didn't have to bring in those other elements in the Factory and the music and the worlds they operated. It was more competitive, it was stranger, he had to play a different kind of character. As a TV broadcaster, as a presenter, as a lover, you know, there would be love for him because it was so, the energy that they were getting wasn't kind of corrupted by this other stuff. They didn't really know any of that. You know, he had almost like a vanity thing. He had some kind of record label over there, strange thing, Northern, you know, manager, music, you know. They didn't really understand it, they didn't get it. And they would love him because of the way he operated as a broadcaster. And he was so powerful as a broadcaster that they would learn so much from him, that love that Richard has for him, you know, goes through to now, without a doubt. And that was the weird thing as well, when Coogan plays Tony, and there's the Partridge element in there. In a way, what it is, as much as anything, it's the Madeley element. It's that Madeley part of Tony, which there was. You know, there was that Madeley part of Tony. He could be that clumsy, he could be that odd. He could be that middle of the road in a weird sort of way. But Richard Madeley, you know, didn't have the situationism as well. And so in that sense, I guess I'm leaning towards suddenly saying that Tony really is Richard Madeley influenced by situations.
What powerful words. Well, maybe he's in the jungle right now as well, so we do want to see how that situation is will sort of translate to the jungle when we get home.
And of course, if he'd lived, he would be doing that kind of thing, because that's the way his life was going. You know?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, and again, this is the stuff which we'll come on to later, that is sort of the sadness towards the end of the book. In one of the last TV appearances Tony Wilson does before he dies is Extreme Celebrity Detox. And there is this strangeness of like, where the TV career peters out, and all this skill and talent kind of does amount to very little at that end point.
Well, it becomes almost thinking about his 13-year theory in terms of what happens in a funny sort of way.
Explain what the 13
Well,
year
Tony's great theory was that everything happened in these 13-year cycles, and so rock and roll starts in 1950 for him, which just happened to be the year he's born. 1963, the Beatles, 1976 punk, 1989 rave, and then he was looking what is 2002, what is 2000, you know. And in a funny sort of way, there was and there wasn't anything, and what there was leading towards social media, leading towards reality television. And the idea that towards the end of his life, you think of McLaren and Johnny Rotten, they were beginning to appear on reality television as well, because these figures of fun, these strange, unusual figures like Wilson, like McLaren, in many ways, the only place they fit in terms of the way the mainstream media understands is reality television. And Tony does do a piece of reality television. He needs the money because he's running out of money. He gets £5 for it. And it's interesting because it's about psychedelic properties of a certain drug that he goes to take with the classic model and the comedian in South America. You get a hint of what Tony might have become if he'd stayed alive, trying to find a role for himself. Because in a weird way, the role of the music mogul probably would have died away because that world had outwitted him to an extent, and why wouldn't it? You can only do it for so much. And also, because he hadn't taken himself seriously as a television presenter to some extent, he wasn't in that world either, presenting great live political election broadcasts as he could have done and should have done. So he was suddenly in the world of reality television.
Next slide, please. The one really interesting element of the book, because a lot, and this is no shade to anyone who's written the books or anything like that, but with the formal factory histories and even 24 Hour Party People as well, which is a film that I do like more than other people seem to. The experience of the women in Tony Wilson's life ends up being quite secondary, the sort of bit part. And this book, there's large amounts of direct speech from the three primary women in Tony Wilson's life. What was the interview process like? Was there any level of, was it difficult to get Lindsay Reid to speak to you, or was that a challenge getting people to speak?
Well, in a way, that's a slight jump ahead to Tony's last days, where they become a bit of a farce because he is very anxious about the wives all being in the room at the same time.
Yes.
So it's like French farce element happens. There's one wife would leave the room, and he's in his last days.
Yes.
He's still concerned about it. There's one wife would leave, another would come in, but they would never be in the room at the same time. And there was an element of that with the book. Who do I go with? Am I going to go with Lindsay Reid at the beginning, his first wife, and Hillary's second wife, and her children? Or Yvette at the end? Yvette is an interesting character. Of course, I couldn't have them all in the book. They couldn't all be in the same book at the same time, unfortunately. So that annoyed me. But then on the other hand, I really wanted to talk to Ollie and Izzy, his children. And we are living in a world, a slightly soapy world that Tony sometimes inhabited, where if I wanted to talk to Yvette, then then Izzy and Ollie would have been upset maybe, and I wouldn't be able to get them all in. So even within it, you've got this sort of slight sense of the chaos of Tony's life, that you can't literally have all the women that he was with in the book at the same time. They just don't fit. So you have to be biased one way. But in the end, for me, one of the most significant women in his life is an early, in fact, his first real girlfriend, which is Roger McGuff's wife. And of course, she already, her first boyfriends have been John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
Oh yeah, he's absolutely thrilled by that.
And now, isn't that fantastic?
Yeah.
Tommy already getting a sense of his own importance, whereas his first real girlfriend has been an ex-girlfriend of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And that gives, I think, a certain swagger to Tommy's sort of presence, you know, the fact that he feels important because he's part of this lineage.
Yeah, very obliquely part of that lineage. There's a human cost to a lot of this, which I think is really interesting. Hilary Wilson says at one point that really there's a separate book that needs to be written called The Factory Casualties, in terms of the people who get discarded, the people who the history doesn't really remember, they don't get nice streets in Manchester named after them. Alan Erasmus seems to come to the conclusion at the end that Wilson was a con man, that's the word used. I'm interested in what you think about the lives that were kind of left behind, because here was someone who had an enormous capacity for, if something didn't work, they could just quite shamelessly move on to the next thing, and that does leave a lot of quite bewildered people in the wake.
He was constructing a work of art out of his personal life, which is a very situationist thing, the idea that the last work of art will really be the way you construct your life, which in a sense is very influential, because now, because of social media, that's the way that a lot of people in fact are operating. They're constructing themselves as an identity, as a brand, as a kind of artwork. And Wilson was one of those kind of pre-social media characters that, because of his influences and what inspired him, was doing a similar thing. He was constructing his own life as a work of art. And that sense of the death in Factory is extraordinary. I mean, Lindsay at one point is shrieking at him after the death of Ian Curtis, death factory, death factory, death factory. And there is that sense that Tommy has to have an enormous thick skin on one hand, to be able to move forward and not be so overwhelmed by it that he's, you know, Lindsay can't believe, for instance, that Joy Division are going to carry on. She's you know, it got a different sort of sensibility about pop culture and what it is, and that myth of it, and the almost trained, spotting nerdism of Tony Wilson about what you can do with history. And as much as he's distraught and devastated by the death of Ian Curtis, there's part of him that understands that it will have an effect, and that it can be manipulated. It doesn't make him a sick man or a cynical man or a cold man. It's simply, you know, inevitable. And also there's something about a love for Ian that they continue as well, because, you know, the idea of him just stopping because Ian has died seems to betray the energy of Ian. So New Order with Rob and Tony do carry on. For someone like Lindsay, this is unforgivable, because the real life isn't true. You know, there's been a suicide, there's been a death. How can you just carry on pop music? But in a funny sort of way, the men are really taking pop music that seriously. I mean, it's a significant indicator of why it is a male brotherhood a lot of the time, because they're taking something really seriously that women are too mature to take that seriously, and it has an enormous impact on our historical sense of popular culture. But the women fade away because they weren't taking it that seriously, because there were more important things with them. And that's a kind of really interesting moment in terms of that brotherhood of Factory Records, and the way that some of the women that were involved, certainly Lindsay and Tony in the early days of Factory, just as much as Erasmus was. But, you know, we remember the men, because they can't possibly take it as seriously as the men do, because ultimately it's quite trivial. But the men are convinced it isn't trivial, and that at that point, that's how history got made.
We've been speaking quite a bit about the idea of kind of duality, and I wanted to ask about, as a writer, it must have been interesting dealing with the contradictions of Wilson, because you kind of got the Catholic Buddhist, the hippie yuppie, the socialist businessman. Was that kind of, there's nothing more boring about than writing about someone who's really straightforward and virtuous? So was that, you seem to cram the book with as many contradictions as you could find?
Well, I was excited about the idea of writing a biography about an unusual figure, not necessarily Factory Record, Joy Division, Happy Monday, but just an unusual figure. How did this figure come about? What made him the way he was? How was he constructed? And I was as interested in the idea of writing a biography about an odd, tremendous figure as I was about anything else. And I wanted to write the kind of biography that suited someone like Tony Wilson. So at the beginning of the book, you know, I started to construct the idea of a Tony Wilson, to the extent that it doesn't necessarily follow any kind of real logical truth or logical convention. So I was struck by the weird coincidences that there were around him as his life develops. You know, all through his teenage years, the Prime Minister of Great Britain shares his surname, Wilson. There's a film made in the mid-60s, starring Rock Hudson, about a very odd character that gets a chance to invent a second life and goes from being a bored banker to being a weird, mysterious artist. And rather strangely, this character was called Tony Wilson. But and then talking about the writer from the 1950s who wrote about philosophy in quite a non-Oxford way, Colin Wilson. But what this enabled me to do was construct the idea of a character called Tony Wilson in a way that Tony Wilson, I think, would have sort of understood, because he did a lot of it himself. It was very unstable. Something is being constructed. The life of a person that is Tony Wilson is starting to happen, but it's made up of very untrustworthy elements. But on the other hand, they're constructing a certain character, so that when the real things that you can check factually start to happen, the release dates of certain records, the chart placings of certain records, we have a Tony Wilson in place, but he's made up of very unstable elements. It's not necessarily a conventional way of talking about a life. It's a way of constructing someone who lived his life on the cusp between truth and fiction by creating a character that's on the cusp between truth and fiction, which makes him really unusual in the world of rock and pop. It sometimes can be really literal, really white, really male, and the energy of Tony Wilson is not literal or white or male. It's much more fluid. It's much more interesting. It's much more sort of transcendent, and that's what I wanted to kind of communicate. There is an ideological fight sometimes to make it blander than it is, to make it ordinary and obvious. And I wanted to resist that by sometimes, you're not supposed to do this, it's illegal. But what the reviewers often talk about, my digression, that I'm digressing. I don't think I'm digressing, I'm creating further focus.
Yes.
Because it can't, no one can possibly know what a life is like. No one can possibly know what relationships he had was like. But what you can do is create a series of illusions and impressions and dream states that are as real and as objective as pretending you know the actual facts. And as a writer, the idea of doing that about Tony Wilson, the master of that kind of peculiarity of what is real and what is not real, what is true and what isn't, it gave me the opportunity to create the kind of book that the bastard probably knew I was going to write all along.
Grab the next slide, please. So I'm going to read out, this is something that Peter Saville says to you in the book, and I think really if we're talking about what's important about this life and the impact it ends up having on a city, this is getting to sort of the real meat of it. This is Peter Saville. Ian's death is the point at which the proceeds of Joy Division's sales create the empowering facilitator of money. Suddenly there is money, it's like a real business, and there is the unscheduled, unimagined potential to do something like the Hacienda, which was otherwise pure fantasy. It only cost Ian's life. I say that with the utmost respect. It wasn't borrowed, there was no interest to pay on that money. The entire factory history is based on the capital of Ian's life. The tragedy then made the city happen the way it did. I once said to Howard Bernstein, the chief executive of Manchester City Council, that I believe modern Manchester stands on the investment of Ian Curtis's life. I feel that very strongly. Modern Manchester owes a lot to all of this, and at the very heart of it is a kind of sacrifice. That is the capital investment. And the first grand project is the Hacienda. And that is the point at which the significant impact upon modern Manchester society is leveraged. Now, what do you think Saville means by that in terms of how modern Manchester society is changed by these individuals?
Well, there's no doubt that the direction of the city changed considerably because there was money. And because they didn't reinvest it in making records, or indeed what their sound maker, Martin Hannett, wanted, which was that they invested it in a Fairlight computer, which at that moment was the most important way of making music. Trevor Horn, Quincy Jones were making those records in the early 80s using the Fairlight. For Martin Hannett, whose role was music, it was obvious that they would use that money to buy the Fairlight computer, so they could compete sonically with those records. But of course for Tony and Rob and Alan especially, that wasn't important. What was important in a way, and certainly I think they all shared this vision in their own way, was the idea that you could take hold of a city, and it was a situationist influence, the idea of what is a city, how does a city get made, who makes the city? And there were the town planners, there were the council, there were the leaders, there were the politicians, there were the usual kind of personalities that we associate with how a city gets made. But they very much had that idea, why can't it be a romantic, a philosopher, a poet, a maverick, a strange character that has a contribution to how a city gets built as much as anything else. And the idea that they use the money to invent and create this club, there is a world where Tony would, now he'd made his mind up he was going to stay in Manchester, he wanted certain things in the city that he would find in New York or Milan or Los Angeles, a boutique hotel, a super club, a cocktail bar. He would bring them to Manchester. That was his ego and his selfishness in a way, his vanity. I want one of those, let's have one. But the super club and the idea of building it is a real contribution to the idea that the underground, the mavericks, the outsiders, and because he's also an insider, because of Granada Television, that throws a different kind of spin on it. But the idea that they could have a say on how a city is, and Wilson appreciates, whether he knows it or not, and I think he knows it a lot more than other people might give him credit for. He suddenly has a chance to contribute to how a city takes shape and what it's for and who it's for. And it is for the dreamers and the poets and the philosophers. It's not necessarily for business. It's not building high like they've done since. This is the conventional consequence of Wilson's dream.
Yes.
It's building almost, taking what's usually underground and just putting it one floor up. Usually we had to go downstairs into strange places to find the Twisted Wheel or whatever the other clubs were. We were always going downstairs. Suddenly we've got it on the ground. It's magnificent because it's architectural. Mm-hmm. It's the first modernist building in Manchester per se since the Granada Television Studio. It's also kind of run by weird mavericks who are into art and put screaming popes and Francis Bacon paintings in the foyer. So it's got a kind of Manchester tradition, and it makes no sense. It's not a function, because Wilson certainly isn't thinking of it as a dance group, because he doesn't like dance music. Dance music is disco. For Wilson, disco is disgusting. So it's not a dance club at that point. But what it is saying, and they said it at the time, and even I might have smirked, we're doing it for the people. We're doing it for the city. But oddly enough, they really were. They could have spent that money on other things. It could have gone in their pocket. They could have just gone on making more records. But in fact, it went on something that did alter the trajectory of the city.
And we'll discuss a little bit shortly what that does to the city, and I think we understand what that does to the city, and I really agree that's a cultural intervention for the people who live there. But what does the hacienda do to the man? Because it's all well and good at the start, but I don't think he ever expected to be dealing with gun violence or drug dealers in that kind of way. And it clearly takes its toll on him as an individual. What does that process look like?
Yeah, in a way that process reminds me a little bit of the world as we are now, where those that operate in a dream world, in the social media world, that they can say what they want and they can make it happen. When the real world interferes with that, there's a jarring. And in a way, Tony had gone into a dream world and had created a dream state. A dream sort of environment, whether he was particularly aware of how it was happening, and to some extent the dance music that emerged was nothing to do with Tony, and he would visit it a little bit like Prince Charles would visit a garden centre. He would dream that. And what did interest him was when acid got mentioned, and he understood that acid house, that he understood. But it's that sort of sense of what destroys someone like Tony, in a way, who is creating dreams, is when reality enters the picture. And he has to deal with the police, and he has to deal with the crime lords, or whatever they're called, the gang lords, that shows how weak I am. But whatever they are, he has to deal with them, Because in a way, his dream is starting to seep into reality, and it's becoming something slightly different. And that's when it starts to get dangerous and difficult and uncomfortable. And not interested in that. He's not interested in the details. He's interested in creating these, as I was saying earlier, these alternative situations, these alternative rituals.
But what were your recollections of the Hacienda person? I mean, you mentioned that you maybe initially were perhaps even a bit snippy about this idea. What are your recollections of going and watching it as that progresses?
Well, I'm a big fan of the first 2 weeks of the Hacienda. Only 4 or 5 people would go. You know?
Yeah.
I really liked it then, and by the time it became what it became, the super club, the true super club, and having a different kind of influence, you know, I'm far too old to really, you know, appreciate or understand it. I remember when I was signing 808 Stake to ZTT at the end of the 80s, and they were telling me about the fact that people blow whistles, and they were really excited about it. And I remember thinking then, I am too old, and that was, you know, nearly 40 years ago. But what was clearly happening was something. It was happening within the city again, another kind of energy that was starting to happen. And Wilson was very good at spotting that, and in a way writing the headlines for it, because he was the journalist. So he could turn it into something. He could take this raw information, this raw energy, and make it something. He could give it a headline. It could be he didn't come up with it, but he would spot it. And that goes back to his ITN skills, you know, Manchester, Acid House, you know. The idea of something happening that he could claim for Manchester and make happen because he had the skills as a sort of media personality to present that to the rest of the world. And that's when he became, you know, a significant figure. The idea that he didn't necessarily generate anything of this, but he was very good at encapsulating it and presenting it, promoting it.
Next slide, please. So this is Tony Wilson Place, which I'm sure a lot of you will have been to. It's in Manchester. It's this weird public-private space. That building there is offices, and you've got 24-hour security people there. And this is sort of deemed as the interesting tribute to Tony Wilson. And one of the motifs that's through the book is be careful what you wish for. And I think in the case of Manchester, that is really important with the city, in that a lot of what Wilson tries to bring into being doesn't necessarily benefit the people who he thinks it might benefit. It might actually, yes, there's lots of interesting venues in the city, some of them near the Hacienda, but it's also surrounded by skyscrapers, and it's probably hard never to be an artist in the city. It's interesting in what you think about the kind of the memorialisation of Tony Wilson that has taken place.
Well, I remember not long after, there was a meeting held at the local council by Sir Richard Rees, that wanted to work out how we should memorialise Tony Wilson. And I remember then having a sinking feeling in my stomach, because in a way, what he was talking about in a way was a kind of taming almost of something. That there'd been this disruptive figure in the city that had created all sorts of extraordinary, unusual elements to help the city become something else. And it was to do with the imagination, and it was provocative, and it was strange. And his best moments were when he was interested in these strange things. And what they wanted to do was name a street after him, but they thought this was an incredible gesture. But it sounded, to those of us inspired by Tony, it sounded a bit dreary, a bit ordinary. You know, the idea that happened seemed to almost seal the story, stop it, you know, stop the story, rather than allow it to spread and spread its wings and grow stranger. And what he did, he gathered 40, 45 people in this room. And they were all local entrepreneurs and comedians. Steve Coogan was there, and actors and journalists and all sorts of people that worked with Tony and had an interesting kind of idea about Tony. And I remember thinking halfway through the meeting, as it got drearier and drearier, and oh my God, the one person we really need to help us understand how to remember Tony Wilson is not here. And by the very nature of the fact we're trying to remember him, of course he couldn't be there. But we needed someone like Tony. Tony could have pieced together, the populist with the intellectual, with the emotional, with the well-researched. And we didn't have, and not 45 of us could really come together to bring Tony Wilson to understand it. I made a pathetic attempt, because I tried to sort of say to Sir Richard that it would be really great actually if we didn't call it Tony Wilson Street or Tony Wilson, just call it Wilson with an asterisk. And you followed the asterisk and you went somewhere, and there was an explosion of information, and he dismissed it out of hand and almost got removed from the room. And in a way you could see already that way Wilson could somehow work with those people as he did, I think, you know, and be subversive in kind of full, you know, full frontal subversive, but somehow deal with them and make things happen. None of us knew how to do that, you know, and so I just sounded like a whiny idiot, you know. I intentionally did that. I thought we've got to try and continue this spirit of Tony Wilson that isn't about music and gold discs and having hit bands, but this other side of Tony, the stranger side, the more disruptive side, the surreal side. That's Manchester as much as anything. But of course, the way that Hacienda becomes the Yellow Submarine, there is a world where really what starts to take over is the Oasis, because the Oasis refers to a world that people like Smith can understand, or rock music. You know, in a way, Tony was talking about rock music, ideas, and a certain kind of avant-garde spirit almost. And you know, naively, I assumed that that's what we were there to talk about. But in fact, no, what we were really there to talk about is to seal the deal that Tony Wilson had just had that. And it's become that. And the way that's funny enough the part of the story as well. That's what it is.
Yes.
You know. And could it have been anything else? You know, is that a kind of punctuation mark to that extraordinary life? That, you know.
And that Manchester changes without him as well.
Yeah.
This is something you write about in the book. I mean, personally, I think you can draw a line from some of the regional populism of Tony Wilson to what you sort of soft regional populism of Andy Burnham now. A lot of that same rhetoric is used. It does come from that. But also the fact that things happened in Manchester, which you write about over the last couple of years, that just changed the tone of the city. So you write about the bombing and things like that, and how it then creates a different idea of Manchester. So interested in that.
Well, that was another thing that made the book take time. You know, just as I think, I'll finish it now, the bombing at the arena happens, and a different Manchester emerges.
Yes.
And Tony's very good at understanding that, the way that history replaces history becomes something else. But post the arena bombing, the idea of Tony Wilson becomes something different, because there's a big new influence in the state of the city, if you like. And Tony shifts somewhere else, either backwards or over there, or, you know, and in a way, I had to sort of take another couple of years to write a different kind of book, because Tony Wilson fits differently into that world than he did before it happened. And you see him slipping back slightly into the 20th century, which is a very different place. And you realise he's a very 20th century kind of figure. And he dominated and operated brilliantly in the 20th century. But it is such a strange, different place now, that in that sense it is the difference between late 19th century and the 1960s. You know, you think of those two areas, they're so different. And Manchester, industrial Manchester in the 1960s, Manchester, very different. That's happened very quickly. Tony is now in a different place. And so the book had to be written, and I'm glad I did it in a way. Whether it's worth anything to anybody at all, but I'm glad I did it. That in a way there is that sense that Tony now exists in a different kind of Manchester. We see Tony in a different way. You know, my ultimate conclusion is that the statue to Tony, the memorial to Tony, is in those buildings you see alongside the canal now, with the big glass windows, and inside you can peek inside and see modern furniture. And there's a weird kind of sense that that's the memorial of Tony, for better or worse. That that's the image of the city. That's what the city is. The city has that. And we go back to the Hacienda being the beginning of that kind of architectural influence. We go back to the idea that once upon a time barely anybody lived in the centre of the city. And it may not mean anything, but that's one consequence of Tony Wilson or Hacienda. What I guess I'm yearning for, and the only way I can do it is in a book, which itself is an old-fashioned, dated kind of thing now. So that's the only way I can is point out that this was the moment in time, and Tony was an interesting figure in that moment in time. That's all you can do, and everything else has its consequences. And for a lot of younger people, Tony Wilson is a distant memory. And in the same way you turn a corner and see a building in Manchester that was built over 100 years ago, it's a little bit like that with Tony. But on the other hand, I think there is a kind of metaphysical influence on the nature of the city that could burst forth again, because it hasn't completely done. You know, that's the way to do it. that's tame, that's burying it. But it's very difficult to explain to those people why that is so, because they, quite rightly, with the best of intentions, think this is lovely. Tony Wilson, it's beautiful. But what am I? But Elliot came up with the best idea, which was the statue of Tony Wilson that goes higher than the highest tower in the city, and you see on the train when you come in, you see it all around.
About as big as Beetham Tower, if you can imagine.
Bigger than Beetham. And what we live in is a world where once Wilson was going to become the mayor, and the local council were genuinely scared of it. Now it's more likely to be Gary Neville. That's what he's saying, because he's still a man, he's still an outsider, he's still someone unusual, but he's lacking the Raymond Williams and the Gina Board. Now that might just be being sentimental for I want that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think Manchester wouldn't really have the sonic signature it had if it wasn't for Raymond Williams and Gina Board and its influence and others. And then we really have to start wondering, what does that really mean? And then we realise that, a lot of things have changed a lot. And we're looking for something that may not exist anymore.
Let's have the next slide, please. So this is sort of a prompt to talk about kind of the lazy years of Tony Wilson. This is Tony Wilson and Yvette Livesey. They look like it's an ITV Sunday night crime drama a little bit. So yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on the final years, because kind of the final project that Wilson seems to want to do is this regeneration of sort of Burnley and parts of East Lancashire. And the idea is it will have a flag. We will call it PL because that worked for LA, Pennine, Lancashire. And I'm interested, and he also gets involved with a group, starts a group called the Necessary Group, which is quite prophetic in some ways, because it was set up to deal with, if there was going to be a referendum on Northwest independence, then let's have the political and celebrity infrastructure in place to react to that. But I'm interested in what you think of Wilson in those later years, because he's kind of out of the cold from the music industry as well at this point.
He is, and he still has ideas, and they're interesting ideas on paper. And there is a world where, of course, most people in that world of town planning and regeneration of regions, and the people in the world of pop music are looking at him saying, well, what are you doing all this shit for? Why don't you just give us all the Happy Mondays? But there was something about Tony that was really interesting. As much as he understood and admired and was happy with the kind of things he'd done, he didn't want to keep looking back, he wanted to keep moving forward, but it was increasingly difficult for him to do, as often happens with someone like him, because the trap is that people just want him to do the same thing. And even though he knows intellectually that he can't do another Joy Division in 2005, he can't do another Happy Mondays, the world has changed, he has to do something else. He's still got energy, and he still wants to do something, and he's still got this kind of wonderful, whimsical commitment to changing situations and having an intellectual approach to how a region changes. And he's kind of not wrong, and in a way many of the ideas he has, well, you were saying it earlier, you can see them in Hebden Bridge, you can see them in certain areas of the world where the hipsters have taken over. He's not wrong. And his document for Pennine, Lancashire is one of his greatest feats, and should be turned into a feature film as much as anything else. Because it's not what people understand and appreciate. They want a hit record, they want a certain scene, they want a sound to the scene. And Tony was sort of advanced in one way because he was anticipating a world that was about to happen. But it wasn't what people wanted from him. They just thought he was in the music business. And even when he was in the music business, he was still into things like Pennine, Lancashire. And with Pennine, Lancashire, with all those things he's doing with Regeneration, he's still getting Peter Saville to design the flag, and he's still getting really excited about it. But of course, the world has moved on, it's gone to other places, and he knows that, and he understands that. And so there's a melancholy about it in a way, about where he is and what he's doing. Because what can he do? Where can he go? The obvious answer is go work for CNN and become the greatest political broadcaster in the world, but he loves this other stuff because it's in his system now.
Yeah, I think it's your phrase that he's running out of Wilsons to be, which I think is quite a nice way of looking at those later years. The story you do get to tell in the book, that it's kind of the first time this has been told in a sort of serious way. is about the last year of his life and his death. And if you read those sections, I found them enormously moving. There's a really redemptive quality to the dignity with which he seems to face his death. Tell me about the experience of writing that, and also just your recollections of that time, the last time you spoke to him, for example.
When you're moving outside Tony Wilson, Anthony Hayes Wilson, all the obvious stuff, you're
Yeah.
moving into the end of a life, his life,
Yes.
and what that means, the reality of it. And in a way, that's another reason why you as a writer, you've hopefully structured and created something you can really believe in, so that when it comes to the end of his life, it's enormously powerful. How he deals with it, what he's dealing with, what does it mean? How does he end those? How does he end his life? And having done that, how does he reconnect down with Adam's? He's trying to speak for years, for years. For me, that was the moment of writing a book about an interesting character, where it comes to life, even as we're talking about death, because we're not talking about Joy Division or the hacienda, we're talking about the raw state of the consciousness decaying, the body decaying. And Tony's attempt to come to the end of his life and deal with what he's done, deal with his sort of that duality between Catholicism and Buddhism, deal with the idea. Another thing we haven't mentioned, but his friendship with one of the writers that pretty much goes through his about Book of the Dead, and Tony's looking here in the last days of his life for some kind of clue, some sort of help. And once upon a time it made sense about how he died, but it didn't make any sense when he actually was dying. And the idea of all these people that crowd around, these wonderful people, Vinnie Riley, is there as he dies. The great Bruce Mitchell, another candidate for Mr. Manchester, is there as he dies. People are coming in and out of his. Elliot's coming in and out of the room where he dies. And that sense of trying to work out as a man dies, what has he actually done? What achievements has he actually done, really, in a wider sense? We think they're hugely significant to me because of the life I've lived, and I've lived the life I've lived, and Tony was a huge influence on me. So they're going to be. But how do I make that interesting to anybody who's just interested in how a person dies and what they've done in their life? The family, the children. The fact that he strips away all the Wilsons that we think of and becomes incredibly brave in a way, the way he does deal with this. When I had last dealings with Tony, he was still Tony in the sense of Another Great Adventure, Darling. He would do that thing. He would still play. One of the things that fascinated me about writing the book was every single person he knew, and he knew so many people like different Tony Wilson. And he could play that Tony Wilson to that person, and he could play, what he assumed I wanted from Tony to the last moments of his life. He still held on to it. He was still constructing the life as a work of art. He was still performing in a way, even in those moments. And that idea of writing a biography, which I take very seriously as a writer, that seemed to be a very significant part of the life, as much as all the obvious hits of his life. And in a way, one of the I've read about many other people, and it is interesting that greatest hits of someone is that thing that is the most mysterious and the strangest and the most neglected or ignored or difficult to fathom is those last moments. And I wanted to try and get that across with Tony, just as my version of a statue, if you like, my version of the headstone that Peter Saville designs. That's my honouring of Tony Wilson, trying to write the best I can about the death of someone that endlessly fascinating.
Okay, well, we're going to have, I think it's a really nice, interesting point to leave it for. We're going to have an interval. You'll all see the little cards that are knocking around the room with your questions. So we're going to take the Q&A part of the evening now. So the first one, and we might as well go in at the deep end. What was the worst argument that you had with Tony, Paul?
Yeah, we had a few. I remember really being annoyed with him once because he had a technique for really getting under your skin. And I suppose that was also significant in terms of that thing you got under my skin about you or what. But you could also do it under other circumstances. And I remember once I was very proud of a Human League t-shirt I had in the early 80s. I'm so proud of this t-shirt. There's a fantastic picture of me with Jerry Garcia, and I'm wearing this Human League t-shirt. Oh, it was absolutely vile. For him, it was. I don't know what it meant to him, but he was so nasty to me. But we had lots of other, all sorts of sort of arguments about more serious things in a way. But in a way, I guess that's a Cambridge thing. My wife and my daughter have been to Cambridge now, so I understand it more. That setting up challenges in a way, setting up theories to debate and work around. I didn't really get it back then when Tony would do it. Tony was a master at it. I mean, he goes back to his debating days at school as well. We have a great picture in the book of him winning a trophy for debating. He was really into that idea of arguing with people. He would argue with Madeley. That fantastic argument they had. Madeley tell him off for Joy Division, for the name Joy Division.
Yeah, I'd love to have been applied. Madeley refers to that as a philosophical ding dong. So
Yeah.
I'd love to apply the word
and once, he loved winning arguments. He didn't like losing them, but then he claimed he never lost an argument. But those, I didn't know what it was. But I guess in a way that, for better or worse, it's kind of helped make who I am and what I do and how I do it because of those kind of weird occasions with Wilson, the weird encounters with Wilson.
As you were coming in and just then as well, you'd be listening to the music of Vinnie Riley, the duality column, Painter, Wilson. And there's a question of can you write a book about Vinnie Riley next, please? But I think what that question is really saying was the significance of Vinnie Riley in the story and...
Yeah. Well, Vinnie's one of the characters that haunts the book in a way, and I give a lot of time suddenly, some people might call it a digression, about Vinnie describing those early moments with Tony and how those early records got made because of Tony. Tony almost again in the way I was saying earlier about, give me a cocktail bar, give me a club, also give me the kind of record I want to hear. And Vinnie Riley would make these records, often just for Tony to play in his car. And that wonderful way, that first record that Vinnie made with Martin Hannett, how that came about. There's extraordinary music. You can't really give it a genre. It's not jazz. It's not anything really. It's just pure music. But what was wonderful about it is this early factory music doesn't belong anywhere. It's not fashionable. It's not a part of the scene. It's just beautiful music made. Certainly with Vinnie and Martin on that first record, start to explore potential. Explore the idea of what making a record is. And Vinnie is one of the many characters that haunts the story of Tony because, duality column to an extent, I decided at the end of the book, we're really a trio. And the trio was Vinnie Riley, Bruce Mitchell and Tony Wilson. And Tony is there, looking over the shoulder of Vinnie as he comes up with the chord, like a patron, saying, I want it this colour, and do this. And it's part of the side of Tony that is romantically committed to the idea of wonderful music. And bizarrely, in Wythenshawe, in Levenshulme, he finds it. He finds this it's part of the magic of factory in a way. The strange characters that move, whether it's Peter Saville, or Martin Hannett, or Vinnie Riley, or Rob Gray, or Ian Curtis. That Tony is in the middle of this circulation of extraordinary characters that are possibly the best of what they do.
There was some intrigue about the subtitle to the tagline, to 24-Hour Party people read Tony Wilson, genius, poet, twat, and the person who wrote this has got no issue whatsoever with the genius, no issue with the twat, but the poet bit seems to confuse them. Now this isn't a phrase that you coined, but do you believe that Tony Wilson was a poet?
It depends what you see, you think of as a poet, not necessarily using language, but certainly making an impression. And indeed, his pen on Lancashire post
Yes.
is a kind of poetry. But Tony loved language, and he was a great writer in his own way. And he loved poets. But I think the way he made life rhyme was in a slightly different way, so I would agree with that. And although the twat really should be cut, we should really have the truth of what we really wanted to say at that time. You know. And twat was a softening. It was a Richard Lee's softening. You know, it wasn't Wilson. It was Tony Wilson Place.
What do you think of the MIF factory building? And I suppose this is sort of in 2014, getting George Osborne in the House of Commons adjourning that any child of 1980s will be delighted that we are calling this new arts centre factory. But it's ended up, I think, it's taken even longer than your book. It's been about 10 years.
Well, I was trying to, at one point I was trying to work it out. We come out at the same time.
Yeah.
And then I thought, no, they're going to win. They're going to finish it first. And I thought, no, I'm going to bloody win.
Yeah.
I'm going to finish first. This was an extraordinary moment. But also the factory building thing was interesting. I remember Erasmus saying to me, you know, we'll have a Wilson room, we'll have a Breton room, we won't have a fucking Erasmus room. He was very bitter about it. But it was significant that Osborne would only give the money when it was called Factory. When it was called after the Manchester International Festival, I think it was the first name they came up with was International. And there was 50, 60, 70, 80 million pounds, and Osborne said, I'm not going to give you 80 million quid for a building called International. And he was right, because that's Sir Richard Lee's, that's tall buildings, that's rubbish. And so there's peculiarly, there's part of his twisted memory about why it has to be factory, and I'll give you 80 million for that, that's right. The fact that what it will go on to be is another softening, is not the statue bigger than the Hebden builders. But on the other hand, those that do it are puzzled by our attitude of disagreement or opposition. You know, it's cost 150, 160, it's called factory. But you're thinking, yes, but that's still not it.
Yes.
Why don't you listen to us, you bastards? You know, this is all we've got. This is all we've got. Why won't you understand? You know, we're telling you what Wilson was about. Why will you not understand? Savile told me, I don't know if I managed to get it in the book, because believe it or not, much was cut out. But Savile was saying that when they originally came up with the idea that it was the factory, and Osborne therefore agreed to give the money, and then Remy Koolhaas and his company, the great modern architecture said, postmodern architects said that they would agree to do it. When they had their first meeting and they sat down around the table with all those people, they were going, well, where's Savile? Where's Peter Savile? And they're going, what do you mean Peter Savile? And I said, well, how can we do this without Peter Savile? And Peter Savile wasn't in the first meeting. And then in a way that's significant in a way about how they approached it, but that removed the characters that made it in the first place. Because in a way they're uncomfortable and difficult and they don't quite understand it. But without it you would not have got Remy Koolhaas and you would not have that kind of building. But unfortunately, what ultimately happens is we get the kind of building that will do the kind of things it does, and it will be, the kind of thing they don't understand why we're still moaning about it. Because it's missing a lot of elements. And those are the elements that actually invite the idea and the kind of architect like Remy Koolhaas to want to do it. But they don't understand that. And even as I say it, I realise how naive I'm being. But on the other hand, it's that naivety that creates the situation that means that we get that kind of building. The building will be great on the outside, but not on the inside.
What do you think Tony Wilson would have made of modern day Manchester city centre?
Now, when we decided to do it this way, we thought that we would get questions like this.
You haven't seen the other questions. well, I suppose that fits. Go on, I'll let you answer.
Well, because I always find questions like this really difficult, because it's like, he isn't here to say it, and he isn't here to do it. There is a bit in the book where he talks about, he's launching his own fake autobiography, the novelisation of 24-hour party people. And he talks about what's going on in the city, and he implies that, it is a case of be careful with the whistle. But the point is, I can't really answer the question because there is no world where that can happen, so therefore I always find it very difficult. The idea that Wilson would be around now to talk about it, well, we kind of know what he would think, because he would still be throwing out spanners in the works, he would still be complaining. But if he was still alive, it wouldn't be like it is. There would be a subtle shift, there would be a bigger shift. It wouldn't quite have happened. He was never directly responsible, he was never politically responsible, he was never part of the situation. But it was his goading the council when they were being at the most weak and trying to compete with Stockport and Barnsley, just building a shopping centre to say, get the Olympics. It was him, that's where it came from, that kind of, so the ambition that goes when Tommy Wilson goes, that somehow still has an impact on the local council, maybe because he's Granada, maybe because he's that person as well, wouldn't have happened if he was just factory. You know, that goes missing, so obviously it wouldn't be quite what he wanted. But on the other hand, you know, there is a world where it wouldn't have been anything like that without him. You know, so I don't want to undermine him, but on the other hand, I don't want to overblow it. You know.
At a point when competition was a lot more active than cooperation, how do you feel Tony as an individual was able to bring groups together and provide a catalyst for people to do new jobs properly and collaborate, and what sort of personal skills that he'd have that allowed that to happen, which it undoubtedly did?
Well, I suppose one of the things is he had that capacity not to interfere. The great example is obviously Savile, where he allows Savile to do the kind of things that no one else would have allowed him to do at the time, certainly not now, because they would be always interfering with everything he's doing. You can't do this, you can't do that, it must be done like that, it doesn't work commercially, it won't work in a record shop, it won't do this, it won't do that, it won't be this. And then what can emerge out of that kind of permission and allowance and creating a freedom of space, which he appreciated when he did the best things he did at Granada. No one pulling him back, no one suggesting he do it a different way, no, designed by committee. The freedom he gave certain individuals to do the sort of things they did had the kind of impact that it could only have because there was no control. Everything is so controlled now. And now, you know, nothing like that could appear because the control would immediately be handed over to a department that's in all entertainment companies called audience development. And it would immediately go into logarithms and algorithms and instant market research. And Tony was great and significant, like all the best radical impresarios are. It was no demographics, no searching who likes what already. Take them somewhere else, move them somewhere else. That cannot happen now because of social media, because it's instantly reported and notated and noted. Who is what? Call them buckets. Audiences have been turned into buckets. There's a bucket for this, a bucket for that, a bucket for that. Wilson was one of those characters that represents the last great moment pre-social media that kind of thing could happen.
I think going into that as well, one of the things that I found very inspiring that I saw on some YouTube documentaries about Tony Wilson, that we see was like, be your own customer, which is totally anathema to that approach.
Well, it's that thing about wanting a club, wanting a cocktail bar, wanting a boutique hotel, you know, what do I want? And not having it go through, I mean, you know, one of the things that he was a big inspiration on me whenever I got involved in those non-journalistic things, like Frankie Goes to Hollywood, was not taking notice of those stupid meetings where people are trying to sort of plot it out, plan it out, and work it out, and anticipate it based on market research. I remember the first market research, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and we'd already been #1 for 9 weeks, as I keep reminding me. And the market research says 0% of the people understand your sleeves. And I was therefore meant to change them, you know. And then I thought, yeah, but hang on, you know, who are you asking? Who are these people you're asking? You know? And ever since then, I've realised that the world is increasingly taken over by this wonderful new department called audience development. Audience development is killing us politically, culturally, in all areas, because people can basically anticipate and interpret who the audience is and completely give them exactly what they want. And the best people, and Tony again was a great symbol of this, never did that.
in these very different times, is it still possible for such a great leap forward to happen culturally, emanating from one label, genre, or group? Do you think that idea of that kind of rapid cultural progression is something that can happen now, or was that really unique to that 20th century moment?
If you're talking about a label, a group, a genre, yes, it's gone. That's gone. The technology of the time, the immense, constant pressure of popular culture is a thing that anybody talks about, as exemplified by daily materials of Philip Schofield. Everyone is basically aware of popular culture. But popular culture without a subversive element. So those things that question implies, which is a nostalgia for when a label, a group, a genre could significantly alter the direction of music, of our listening sort of experience. Those things are completely gone because there's so much that immediately gets in the way. Not least an unbelievable self-consciousness that this exists. Whereas certainly that back in Tony, Tony was one of the few people who understood that. Now kind of everybody, they call them influencers, everybody knows it. And it doesn't mean that was better and this is worse, it just means that kind of thing, absolutely.
Okay, well I think that's a really good point on which to end it. I know people do have trains, and I apologise for slightly overrunning in the initial bit, but can I just thank everyone for the fantastic questions, and more importantly, thank Paul for the terrific talk and the